We're going to look at Jonah chapter 1, starting with verse 10 through verse 12. And so I'll read verse 10 and then we'll talk about it. Vayira'u ha'anashim yira gedolah. Vayomeru elaiv ma zot asita. Ki yada'u ha'anashim ki milifnei Adonai hu boreach. Ki higid lahem. We begin with a vav consecutive imperfect. This comes from the root yareh, and the only interesting thing that happens here is that the first yod in the root letter quiesces, so it becomes vayira'u. Other than that, it looks pretty much like a strong verb, except for the R1 letter. Instead of having a silent shawah, it just quiesces. Ha'anashim is the subject here, so we have a masculine plural verb and a masculine plural subject. So, and they, the men, feared. Yirah is a fear. Gedolah. So literally, and the men feared a great fear. That's a very common Hebrew way of saying something. Someone dreamed a dream. Somebody feared a fear. The men feared a fear. We'll see a little bit later in this chapter, people sacrifice a sacrifice and vow a vow. So the men feared a great fear, which we might translate into English as they feared greatly. Vayomeru, and they said, elaiv, to him, meaning to Jonah. So him here equals Jonah. And they said, ma zot asita. And so we have to supply an is, but we get, what is this asita you have done? This comes from asa, and as we'll see later, many times these three hey verbs, sometimes also called three yod verbs, drop out the hey and it's replaced by a yod, probably because in earlier times these verbs actually did have a yod in the third position rather than a hey. So what is this that you have done? I'm doing this more in the perfective sense of you have done something rather than what is this you did. So what is this you have done? We might say in English, what is this that you have done? Supplying a that. Ki yada'u, and here we have a cal perfect of yada for they knew, third common plural, ha'anashim, so this tells us who the they are. The men knew, ki milifnei, min and lifnei, so from before, for the men knew that from before the Lord, hu boreach, he, and then we have this nice cal participle, masculine singular absolute, acting like a verb here. He was fleeing. Normally when you see a participle you will have an explicit subject with it if it's being used like a verb. So here's our explicit subject, he, and then we have boreach, was fleeing, and we put the tense equal to the tense that we're in. So the participle doesn't have tense in itself, but we give it a tense based on the narrative that contains it, and so this is past tense. They knew is past tense, and so this participle is also past tense. For the men knew that from before the Lord he was fleeing. For higid, this is a one noon verb, nagad, we have a hiphil perfect, 3ms, higid, for he told lahem, he told them. So we have to them, he told to them, he related to them. And so we have then the whole sentence. And the men feared a great fear, and they said to him, what is this you have done? For the men knew that from before the Lord he was fleeing, for he told them, or perhaps he had told them, more that perfective idea. All right, verse 11. Vayomru elaiv, ma na'aseh lach, vayishtok hayam me'aleinu, ki hayam holek vaso'er. Another vav consecutive imperfect here. And they said, elaiv, to him, ma na'aseh. And so this is a one guttural. And that's why we see the patach here under the prefix, because it's reflecting the hatef patach under the R1 guttural. So this is a kal, even though prefix vowel patach is a little confusing. Here it's not a true patach, as it would be for a hifil. It's reflecting, so it's a fake patach. Normally that would be a hirik. And so we have, what shall we do? It's a one common plural imperfect. What shall we do? Lach, to you. And here, because in pausal, normally we would expect this to be laka, but in pause, it's written like we have here. And now we have vayishtok. And here's the idea, what shall we do to you? Literally, and the sea will be still, or be silent. And so we would probably say, what shall we do to you that, rather than just and the sea will be silent, that the sea may be silent. Maybe sort of a subjunctive idea there. Me aleinu, from upon us. Preposition doubled with another preposition, from upon us. Ki hayam, for the sea, holek v'so'er. So we have a couple of participles here, a couple of kal participles actually. And this is halak, which is to go. And so for the sea, literally was going and was storming. With halak, sometimes we use that in conjunction with other words, perhaps to mean something more like was continuing to storm or was even increasing its storming. But literally going and storming. All right, so let's take a look at verse 11. And they said to him, what shall we do to you that the sea might grow silent from upon us? For the sea was going and storming. Verse 12 now. Vayomer elehem, Sa'uni uchatiluni el hayam, v'yishtok hayam me'alechem, ki yodea ani, ki b'sheli, hasa'ar hagadol hazeh elechem. So verse 12, and he said, this is Jonah now, so this is just a kal imperfect vav consecutive, and he said, Eleihem, to them, Sa'uni. Here's one of our one noon verbs, and in this case, the noon R1 letter drops off completely because we have an A-class theme vowel. The shurek is telling us that it's a masculine plural imperative, and then we have this one CS pronominal suffix. So we have Sa'uni, pick me up. V'chatiluni, this kibbutz here takes the place of a shurek. So we are expecting an imperative, and sure enough we have a hifil imperative. It's a root we've seen before in chapter 1, tul. In the hifil, that middle vowel turns to a yod. We'll be covering these more in a few weeks. So this is imperative masculine plural of tul, hurl, and then the one CS pronominal suffix, hurl me, so pick me up and throw me to the sea or into the sea. Vayishtok, and now we just have a simple vav conjunction, it's not a vav consecutive, and hayam, and the sea will be silent, the sea will grow silent. Down here at the bottom right, me'alechem. And so we have from upon you, from on you. Ki yodea, and this is a cal participle, where that R1 vowel is written fully in the plene form. Oftentimes we would just see this as Yodea, like that, but here it's written with the holem vav in the plene form. For ani, here's the subject. We usually have the subject with a participle when it's being used like a verb. For I know, ki. So we have this interesting quadruple thing here. We have the preposition beit. We have the sheen, which is the equivalent of a share. So sometimes a share is written just as a single sheen, not too often, but occasionally. Then we have a lamed preposition followed by a pronominal suffix. So literally, in which to me, and we would translate that on account of me or because of me. For on account of me, and then we want to supply an is here. On account of me is Hasa'ar Hagadol Hazeh. On account of me is this great storm. And then finally, Elechem, upon you. So let's take a look at the entire verse here. And he said to them, pick me up and throw me into the sea, and the sea will grow silent from upon you, or that the sea may grow silent from upon you. For I know that on account of me is this great storm upon you. So that is verses 9 through 12.